Hi friends, tonight's story is a rather surprising one about how often knights actually bathed. Forget the idea of mud-caked warriors who never touched water. Many of them loved their baths, perfumes, and even fancy towels. Let's find out how clean chivalry really was. Before we begin today's video, I could really use your help. We've noticed the channel's reach has dipped a little, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, completely free, and it helps us carry on bringing you new and fascinating stories. Your support truly means the world to us, and together we can keep this channel growing. Thank you ever so much. Now, let's get on with today's story, and write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from different corners of the world. Now, lower the lights, make yourself comfortable, and join me as we peek behind the shining armour into the surprisingly fragrant world of medieval knights. I was 7 years old when I first understood that cleanliness was not merely about the body, but about the soul that lived within it. My father's hall stood in Lincolnshire, grey stone rising from greyer earth, and in the courtyard behind the kitchens there was a trough where the horses drank. On certain mornings, before the household stirred properly to life, my mother would send a servant, usually Agnes, who had nursed me as an infant, to heat water over the kitchen fire. Not a great quantity, mind you, perhaps 2 large pots, no more. She would carry them, steaming in the dawn air, to a small chamber beside the chapel. There, in a wooden tub that had been my grandfather's, she would pour the heated water atop what had been drawn cold from the well the night before, and there, shivering in linen that barely covered my thin boy's frame, I would step into that tub while my mother stood nearby with a cake of soap, if soap is what you could rightly call it. More often it was a mixture of ash and fat, sometimes scented with lavender if the harvest had been kind, sometimes smelling of nothing save the rendered tallow of the previous winter's slaughter. Before Mass, my mother would say, not unkindly but firmly, "You will stand before our Lord with clean hands and a clean heart." I did not understand then that these 2 things, the hands and the heart, were thought to be connected in ways that went beyond mere symbol. I knew only that the water was desperately cold despite the steam that rose from it, that my skin prickled and protested, and that somewhere in the chapel the priest was already lighting candles for the morning office. I thought it torment, truth be told, but I did it, as my father did it, as his father had done it, because we were told and believed that to approach the altar with yesterday's soil still beneath your fingernails was to show contempt, not merely for ritual, but for the very presence of God himself. This then is where my story begins. Not with the first time I drew a sword, nor the first time I sat a warhorse, but with the first time I learned that water, cold and uninviting as it was, carried within it something more than mere function. It carried expectation. It carried the weight of how one ought to live. My father was a knight in service to the Earl of Lincoln, not a great lord himself, but respected, landed, a man who had ridden to Scotland twice, and to France once in his youth. He kept his hall as his father had kept it, and as I would later learn most halls of our station were kept, with attention to order, to hierarchy, to the observance of both earthly and heavenly law. The hall itself was cold in winter, warm only near the great hearth where the fire burned from October to March without cease. Smoke rose to the rafters and found its way out through gaps in the thatch, but much of it lingered, giving everything a grey cast, a smell of wood and peat that settled into cloth and hair and skin. We lived within that smell. It was the smell of life itself, clinging to us all. In such a place, the notion of washing daily was not merely impractical, it was nearly impossible. Water had to be drawn, carried, heated. Wood had to be gathered and kept dry. Servants had to be spared from other tasks. And in the depths of winter, when the well froze and had to be broken each morning with iron bars, even the simple act of wetting one's hands became a negotiation with the elements. Yet we did it. Not every day, perhaps. Not as thoroughly as you might imagine. But we did it. My father washed his hands and face each morning, and again before the evening meal. He kept a basin in his chamber, and each night a servant would bring fresh water, sometimes warmed if the season allowed. He would wet a linen cloth, rough woven but clean, and wipe his face, his neck, behind his ears, under his arms. In summer, he might pour the entire basin over his head in the courtyard, letting the water run down his back while he stood bare-chested in the sun. But a full bath, the submersion of the entire body in heated water. This was a different matter entirely. It happened perhaps once each fortnight in winter, more often in summer if the harvest had been good and there was labour to spare. The wooden tub would be dragged from its place in the small chamber and set before the hearth in my father's room. Servants would carry pot after pot of heated water, 6 or 7 trips in all, until the tub was filled nearly to the brim. My father would undress, folding his tunic carefully, and step into the water with a sigh that I can still hear across all these years, a sound of relief so profound it seemed almost sinful. He would sit there, sometimes for the length of a psalm, sometimes longer, and he would scrub himself with a coarse cloth and that same soap of ash and fat. Afterwards, he would emerge pink-skinned and steaming, and he would dress in clean linen that had been aired near the fire. The used water would be carried out and given to the horses, or poured onto the kitchen garden, for even dirty water had its uses. I watched this ritual throughout my childhood, and I learned from it that cleanliness was not a simple thing. It required resources, time, labour, it required intention, and it required the belief, deeply held, that the body was not merely a vessel to be used and discarded, but a temple that must be maintained, however imperfectly, for the glory of God. When I was 10 years old, I was sent to the household of Sir William de Vere in Nottinghamshire to begin my training as a page. My mother wept when I left, though she tried to hide it. My father placed his hand upon my head and told me to remember 3 things: honour God, serve my Lord, and keep myself as clean as circumstances allowed. The 3rd instruction surprised me then. I had expected lessons about courage, about swordsmanship, about the duties of a knight. But my father understood something that I would only later appreciate, that to live among men, to earn their respect, to be welcomed at table and trusted in chamber, one must attend to the small civilities that separate us from beasts. Sir William's household was larger than my father's, his hall grander, his chapel more richly appointed. There were perhaps 40 souls living within the castle walls: knights, men-at-arms, servants, grooms, and half a dozen boys like myself, all being shaped into the men we would become. The master-at-arms was called Hugh, and he was a scarred veteran of the French campaigns who had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to a sword stroke at Crécy. He taught us to fight, yes, but he also taught us to live. And one of his first lessons, delivered on a cold November morning while we stood shivering in the courtyard, was about the maintenance of the body. "You will wash each morning," he said, his voice carrying across the grey stones. "Hands, face, neck. You will wash before meals. You will wash after training. And on Saturdays, you will bathe fully, in rotation, so that on Sunday you may attend Mass as men of station ought to attend it." He paused, looking at each of us in turn. "I care not if you think it foolish. I care not if you find it uncomfortable. You will do it, or you will sleep with the hounds." We did it. There was a rhythm to those years, a pattern that repeated itself week upon week, season upon season. We rose before dawn and went first to the chapel for lauds, standing in the cold darkness while Father Benedict intoned the prayers. Then we returned to the hall for a breakfast of bread and ale, after which we trained until midday. Sword work, wrestling, riding, the endless repetition of forms and footwork that would, in time, become instinct. We ate again at midday, and after the meal we had lessons in letters, in Latin, in the histories of ancient Rome and the deeds of Arthur's knights, then more training or errands or work in the stables, until evening prayers and supper, and through it all, the constant attention to the body's cleanliness. We kept a row of basins in the dormitory where we pages slept, simple wooden bowls that were filled each morning by the youngest among us. We would splash our faces, wet our hair, scrub our hands until the dirt of the previous day was mostly gone. The water was cold, always cold, and in winter it sometimes had a skin of ice that had to be broken before use. Before meals we would wash again, this time with more care, for Sir William was particular about the state of his table. He did not tolerate dirty hands touching bread, nor grimy fingers dipping into shared dishes. To appear at his board unwashed was to invite not merely rebuke, but exile from the meal itself, sent to eat with the servants in the kitchen. I saw it happen once to a boy named Thomas, who had been mucking out stables and had come directly to table without washing. Sir William took one look at his hands, black with horse soil and straw, and pointed to the door. Thomas went, red-faced and hungry, and the lesson was not lost on the rest of us. On Saturdays, as Hugh had promised, we bathed. The castle had a proper bathhouse, a small stone building near the kitchen, where a large tub stood permanently. It was filled by a system that had been built by Sir William's grandfather, a channel that carried water from a spring on the hillside above, ending in a cistern from which water could be drawn directly into pots for heating. We bathed in groups of 3 or 4, taking turns in water that grew progressively dirtier as each boy used it. The first into the tub had the cleanest water, hot and almost pleasant. The last had water that was lukewarm and grey with the soil of 4 bodies. But even grey water was better than none, and we scrubbed ourselves with brushes made of bundled twigs, and with soap that the castle made each autumn from wood ash and the fat of slaughtered pigs. Afterwards, we would dress in our Sunday clothes, which had been kept in a chest near the chapel specifically for this purpose. Clean linen next to clean skin, woolen tunics that had been beaten and aired, hose that had been washed and dried near the kitchen fire. We would attend Compline that evening looking, if not quite like nobles, at least like young men who understood that appearance mattered. And on Sunday, we would go to Mass in the village church, standing behind Sir William and his household, and I would see the way the villagers looked at us. Not with envy exactly, though there was some of that, but with a kind of recognition. We were clean, we were ordered. We were, in our cleanliness, a visible symbol of the distinction between those who commanded and those who obeyed. I must tell you plainly, before this account continues, that for all our washing, for all our attention to basins and tubs and Saturday baths, we were not what you would call truly clean. The film of life itself clung to us. It was in the wool of our clothes, which were washed perhaps 4 times a year, and never quite lost the smell of sweat and smoke. It was in our hair, which we cut short, but which still collected dust and kitchen grease and the sweet sour smell of horses. It was under our fingernails, in the creases of our knuckles, behind our ears, between our toes. We lived with it. We all did. The highest lord and the lowest servant, we all carried the scent of our lives upon us. You must understand that this was not considered shameful. It simply was. The world smelled. Halls smelled of smoke and dogs and rushes that had been strewn on floors for weeks. Stables smelled of horses and hay and the sharp tang of manure. Churches smelled of incense and tallow, and the unwashed bodies of the faithful pressed together in prayer. Cities smelled worse than I can properly describe, a mixture of refuse and tanneries and butchered meat and human waste that ran in channels down the centre of streets. To smell of sweat after a day's training was expected. To smell of horses after a day's ride was natural. To smell of smoke after an evening by the hearth was unavoidable. What mattered was not that you smelled like nothing, for no one smelled like nothing, but that you smelled like a person of station, that you did not smell of the stables if you were not a groom, that you did not smell of the kitchen if you were not a servant, that when you stood close to another man of rank, he could detect on you the scent of clean linen and perhaps a hint of the herbs that had been tucked among your clothes in their chest. Lavender, rosemary, meadowsweet. These were the signs of attention, of care, of a person who understood that the body required maintenance beyond mere survival. I learned to recognise these distinctions during my years in Sir William's household. I learned that one could tell a knight from a man-at-arms not merely by dress or bearing, but by scent. The knight smelled of wool cleaned with fuller's earth, of linen washed in lye, of leather oiled and maintained. The man-at-arms smelled of the same things, perhaps, but older, more worn, less frequently renewed. And beneath us both, the servants smelled of their labour. The kitchen maids of onions and rendered fat, the stable boys of hay and horse sweat, the laundresses of lye and wet cloth. Each person carried their station on their skin. But there was another layer to this understanding of cleanliness, one that went beyond the social markers of scent. There was the matter of the soul. Father Benedict, the castle chaplain, spoke often about the connection between bodily purity and spiritual purity. He would quote from the Psalms, "Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow," and from the church fathers who had written about the necessity of cleansing both body and spirit before approaching the sacred mysteries. "The body is the temple of the Holy Ghost," he would say, standing before us in the chapel, his hands folded across his considerable belly. To allow it to fall into neglect, to permit it to become foul beyond necessity, is to show disrespect not merely to yourself, but to God who created you. This teaching was not unique to Father Benedict. It was common throughout the Church, part of the daily instruction of Christians. We were taught that while excessive attention to the body was sinful, vanity being one of the cardinal vices, proper maintenance of bodily cleanliness was a religious duty. There were stories, passed down through generations, of saints who had practiced extreme forms of cleanliness as part of their devotion. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, we were told, had bathed regularly despite the rigours of monastic life, believing that a clean body helped to maintain a clean mind. Saint Louis of France, the great king, was said to have washed the feet of beggars in imitation of Christ, and to have bathed himself every week without fail. These examples were held before us not as impossible ideals, but as patterns to be followed according to our station and means. Of course, there were also stories that went the other direction. Saints who had rejected cleanliness entirely as a form of mortification, who had worn the same hair shirt for years without washing, who had allowed their skin to become encrusted with the grime of holy suffering. But these were understood to be exceptional cases, extreme demonstrations of devotion that were not expected of ordinary Christians. For most of us, the teaching was simple. Wash when you can, as well as you can, and understand that to do so is to honour both your body and your Creator. I was 16 when I first wore full armour. It was a May morning, the year of our Lord 1342, and I had progressed from page to squire in Sir William's household. My duties had expanded from the simple tasks of childhood to the serious work of maintaining a knight's equipment and assisting him in the field. The armour I wore that first time was not my own, but borrowed from the household stores, a hauberk of mail that hung to my knees, a coat of small iron rings linked one to another, each ring individually riveted closed. Over this went a surcoat of wool, and over my head went a coif of mail, and then a helmet, a simple conical shape with a nasal bar. The weight settled onto my shoulders like a physical presence, like the hand of God pressing down upon me. It was not unbearable, not at first, but it was constant. Every movement required effort, every step was deliberate, and within minutes I was sweating. The mail trapped heat against my body. The padding beneath, a gambeson of quilted wool and linen, absorbed the sweat but could not wick it away. The metal rings warmed with my body heat and held that warmth close. By the time I'd walked twice around the courtyard, my underclothes were soaked. By the time I'd spent an hour in weapons drill, I was dripping. Hugh, watching me struggle through the forms I'd practiced 1,000 times without armour, allowed himself a rare smile. "Now you begin to understand," he said. "This is what knights smell like." He was right. The smell of a man in armour is unique, unmistakable. It is the smell of iron and sweat combined, of metal that has absorbed years of human moisture and carries within it the memory of every man who has worn it. It is not entirely unpleasant, but it is strong, distinctive. Walk past a group of knights who have been training or riding, and you will smell them before you see them. A sharp, metallic tang mixed with the deeper notes of human exertion. And the smell lingers. When you remove the armour, it clings to your skin, to your hair, to your underclothes. The rings of the mail leave small imprints on your flesh where they have pressed against you. Your gambeson is soaked through with sweat that has been trapped between your body and the iron. You peel off layer after layer, and each layer carries the weight of that day's labour. This was when washing ceased to be merely a religious duty or a social expectation, and became a physical necessity. After training in armour, we squires would go immediately to the bathhouse if it was available, or to the trough in the courtyard if it was not, and we would sluice ourselves with cold water, scrubbing away the day's accumulation with rough cloths and sand. We would wash our hair, our faces, our necks and arms and chests, anywhere the mail had touched us, anywhere the sweat had gathered. In summer, this was almost pleasant. The cold water was a relief after hours in the heat. But in spring and autumn, when the air was cool but the work was still hard, it was a torment. You were already chilled from removing the armour, your body confused by the sudden absence of trapped heat, and then you stood in cold water while your skin protested. but it had to be done. If you did not wash after wearing armour, you would develop sores where the rings had rubbed, infections where sweat had pooled and been trapped. I saw men who had neglected this care, who had worn their mail for days without cleaning themselves, and they suffered for it. Angry red marks on their shoulders and backs, places where the skin had broken and begun to fester. Sir William was particular about this. He required his household knights and squires to maintain not only their equipment but themselves. After returning from a day's patrol or training, we were expected to clean our armour, wiping down the mail with oiled cloth, checking for broken rings, ensuring that rust had not begun its slow work of destruction. But we were equally expected to clean ourselves, to wash away the evidence of the day's exertion before we sat at his table or entered his hall. A knight who neglects his body will soon neglect his duties, he would say. Both require constant attention, and so we attended to both. Each evening, before supper, there was a general washing. Knights and squires would gather at the basins that stood near the hall's entrance, and we would wash our hands, our faces, our necks. We would comb our hair with wooden combs, straighten our clothes, make ourselves presentable. It was not a full bath, but it was a marker of transition, a way of saying, I have set aside the work of the day, and now I enter the community of the table as a civilised man. In my 19th year, I rode to war for the first time. It was 1345, and King Edward had called his levies for a campaign in France. Sir William answered that call, and he took with him 3 household knights and 6 squires, myself among them. We rode south in July, joining the gathering army at Portsmouth, and there we waited for ships to carry us across the narrow sea. That waiting, 2 weeks camped in fields near the harbour, thousands of men and horses pressed together in the summer heat, taught me more about filth and cleanliness than all my years of careful training. The camp was a city of canvas and mud. Latrines were dug at the perimeter, deep trenches that filled quickly and had to be covered over and new ones dug. The smell was overwhelming, a constant presence that could not be escaped. Men relieved themselves where they could, and the rain, when it came, washed everything downhill into channels that ran between the tents. Water was precious. What could be spared from drinking and cooking was used sparingly for washing. There was a stream nearby, but it quickly became fouled by the camp's presence, thick with soil and refuse. We did what we could. Each morning, Sir William would send us squires to fetch water from further upstream, before the camp's influence reached. We would fill leather buckets and carry them back, and he would wash himself in his tent using a small basin and a cloth. He washed his hands and face, his neck and arms. He washed his feet, which had been in boots for days and had begun to develop the soft, painful rot that comes from constant moisture. The rest of us washed when we could, which was not often. We rinsed our hands before eating. We splashed water on our faces to remove the worst of the dust and sweat. But a proper bath was impossible, unthinkable. The resources were not there, the time was not there, and there was a sense that such niceties belonged to another world, a world of stone halls and ordered routine that had been left behind. Within days, we all smelled the same. Knights and common soldiers, squires and archers, we all carried the same scent of unwashed bodies and dirty wool, and the particular sharp tang of men living too close together. The distinctions that had mattered in peacetime, the scent of clean linen, the hint of lavender, disappeared beneath the universal smell of the campaign. And yet, even there, some men maintained what standards they could. I watched Sir William, each morning without fail, perform his ablutions in that basin of cold water. I watched him clean his fingernails with a knife point, comb his beard with a wooden comb, straighten his clothes as though he were preparing for court rather than for another day of waiting in a muddy field. When I asked him why he bothered, when clearly no one else was bothering, he looked at me with something like pity. "Because I am not no one else," he said. "I am a knight, and a knight maintains himself even when others do not, especially when others do not." It was a lesson I never forgot. We crossed to France in August, landing near Saint-Vaast-la-Hougue, and immediately began the march that would lead us eventually to the field at Crécy. But before that battle, before that terrible day when the French chivalry broke itself against our archers, there were weeks of marching through the Norman countryside, and in those weeks I learned what campaigning truly meant. We marched, we camped, We marched again. We foraged for food. We fought small skirmishes with local forces. We burned villages whose names I never learned. We slept in fields and forests, sometimes in abandoned buildings, occasionally in the tents we carried with us. And through it all, the constant degradation of the body. Your feet developed blisters that burst and bled and formed new blisters. Your thighs chafed from the saddle until the skin was raw. Your hair became matted with sweat and dust. Your clothes stiffened with soil and salt. Your hands cracked and bled from handling weapons and reins and rope. But the worst was the inability to truly wash. You could rinse your face in a stream, splash water on your arms, drink until your belly was full. But a proper washing, the submersion of the body in heated water, the thorough scrubbing with soap, this was a luxury that belonged to another life. There was a river, though. I remember it still. We had camped near a place called Rains, and there was a river there with a pool deep enough for swimming. It was evening, and the day's march had been long, and some of the men went down to the water to bathe. I went with them, stripping to my linen underclothes and wading into the current. The water was cold, shockingly so, but after weeks of dust and sweat it felt like absolution. I ducked my head under, rubbed my hands through my hair, scrubbed at my skin with sand from the river bottom. Around me, other men were doing the same, knights and archers and common soldiers, all of us naked or nearly so, all of us scrubbing away the evidence of the campaign. There was something holy about it, something that transcended the mere washing of bodies. We were, for that moment, restored to ourselves. We were clean, or as close to clean as we could manage. I floated on my back, looking up at the sky, and I thought about the tub in my father's hall, the Saturday baths in Sir William's bathhouse, the careful attention to basins and soap and clean linen. All of that seemed very far away, but also very precious. It was something to return to, something to remember. When we emerged from the river, our bodies pink and clean in the evening light, Sir William was waiting on the bank. He had not joined us in the water, being older and more conscious of dignity, but he looked at us with something like approval. "Better," he said simply. "Much better." We fought at Crécy 3 days later. I will not describe that battle in detail, for this is not a chronicle of warfare, but of the small acts of maintenance that allow men to live through warfare. But I will say this: after the battle, after the French dead had been stripped and left for burial, after we had gathered what plunder there was to gather, I went down to a stream with my clothes and my body, and I washed both as thoroughly as I could manage. I scrubbed at the stains that had settled into the wool of my surcoat. I washed my face and hands and neck. I cleaned my fingernails, which were black with grime and other substances I preferred not to name. I washed until the water ran clear from my skin, and then I washed again. It did not make me clean, not truly, but it made me feel human, and in that moment, that was enough. We returned to England in October of that year, sailing from Calais with the autumn storms beginning to build over the narrow sea. Sir William brought home the spoils of victory: French gold, captured armour, ransoms promised by noble prisoners. I brought home an understanding that the world was larger and more terrible than I had imagined, and that cleanliness was not merely a habit, but a defence against chaos. The first thing I did upon reaching Sir William's castle was to request permission to bathe. Not the quick washing at a basin, not the rinsing in a stream, but a proper bath in heated water. He granted it immediately, and I think he understood without my explaining what that bath represented. The servants filled the tub in the bathhouse, 6 trips from kitchen to bath chamber, the water steaming in the cool autumn air. They added herbs, lavender and rosemary and something else I did not recognise, and the steam carried the scent up to the rafters. I undressed slowly, peeling away layer after layer of clothes that I had worn for weeks. The linen next to my skin was grey with sweat and soil. My tunic was stiff with salt and smoke. My hose were torn in 3 places and stained beyond recovery, and I stepped into that water with the same sigh my father had given all those years ago, a sound of relief so profound it seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the lungs. I sat in that tub for the length of a psalm, perhaps longer. I scrubbed myself with a brush until my skin was pink and raw. I washed my hair 3 times, working soap through the tangles until it ran clean. I scoured my fingernails, my toes, the creases behind my ears. I attended to every part of my body with the fierce attention of a man who had forgotten what it meant to be truly clean. When I finally emerged, the water was grey and cool, and I was transformed. I was myself again, or at least closer to the self I remembered. The servants burned my old clothes. They were beyond saving, beyond washing, fit only for fuel. I dressed in new linen from the household stores, in a tunic of clean wool, in hose that had never seen the mud of France. And I went to the chapel, where Father Benedict was hearing Compline, and I knelt in the back and gave thanks to God for my return. The next days were spent in recovery and routine. We saw to our equipment, repairing what could be repaired, replacing what could not. We rested, we ate well, we attended Mass daily, and we bathed, not just once but repeatedly, as though trying to wash away, not merely the physical soil of the campaign, but the memory of what we had seen and done. Sir William was generous to those who had ridden with him. To me, he gave a piece of captured armour, a coat of plates, an improvement over the simple mail I had worn, and also coin enough to establish myself. I was 20 years old, and I had proven myself in war. It was time, he said, to think about my future. That winter I returned to my father's hall in Lincolnshire. He was older than I remembered, greyer, but his hall was unchanged. The same hearth, the same chapel, the same small chamber where water was heated for washing. He embraced me when I arrived, holding me at arm's length to look at me, and then embracing me again. "You have come through," he said. "Thanks be to God." We sat together that evening by the hearth, and I told him something of what I had seen. Not the terrible things, not the details that would have served no purpose in the telling, but the small things. The camp at Portsmouth, the river at Erains, the return to cleanliness after weeks of filth. He nodded as I spoke, recognizing in my account something of his own experience. "It is easy to forget," he said, "when you are warm and fed and clean, how precious these things are, how quickly they can be taken from you, how much effort it requires to maintain them." He paused, staring into the fire. "But a man must maintain them nonetheless, not because they are easy, but because they are the small acts that remind us we are men and not beasts. The act of washing before prayer, the act of cleaning your hands before breaking bread. These things matter, even when, especially when, circumstances would allow us to forget them." I understood what he meant, though I did not say so. I had seen men in France who had forgotten these small acts, who had allowed themselves to descend into filth because filth was easy, because everyone else was filthy, because the standards of home seemed irrelevant in the field, and I had seen how quickly such men lost themselves, how they became indistinguishable from the worst elements of any army. The maintaining of cleanliness, I had learned, was not about vanity or comfort. It was about maintaining identity. It was about remembering who you were and who you served, and what separated you from chaos. 3 years after my return from France, the pestilence came to England. You will know it perhaps as the Great Mortality, or the Black Death. I knew it first as a rumour from the ports, a sickness in the east that killed swiftly and without mercy. Then, as a reality in London, where reports spoke of carts piled with the bodies of those whose breath had left them in the night. And finally as a presence in our own countryside, moving from village to village like an invisible army. It reached Lincolnshire in the autumn of 1349. The first deaths were in the coastal towns, then in the market villages, then in the countryside itself. Families disappeared in a week. Entire households were found empty, their doors standing open, their meals cold on the table. My father closed his hall to strangers. We admitted no travellers, no merchants, no pilgrims. Those of us who lived within the walls stayed within them, and those who lived outside were forbidden to enter. But the sickness came nonetheless. It began with Agnes, the servant who had carried water for my childhood baths. She complained of fever and pain in her limbs. By evening she had swellings in her neck and beneath her arms, hard lumps that seemed to grow before our eyes. By the next morning she was dead. We burned her body in the courtyard. There was no priest to say prayers, for the priest had fled. My father spoke the words himself, reading from a psalter while the smoke rose into the grey sky. After Agnes came 2 more servants, then my father's steward, then a groom. They died within days of falling ill, sometimes within hours. The swellings, the fever, the delirium, and then the silence that follows when breath ceases. Through all of this, one constant instruction echoed through the household. Wash. Wash your hands after touching the sick. Wash your clothes if they have been soiled. Wash your face, your hair, anything that might have carried the miasma of sickness. No one knew if this helped. The physicians who had not fled spoke in contradictions. Some said the sickness came from corrupted air, from evil vapours rising from the earth. Others said it came from the conjunction of planets, from divine judgment, from poisoned wells. No one knew, and so we did everything we could think of. We burned sweet-smelling herbs to purify the air. We avoided the sick when possible, and we washed constantly, obsessively, as though cleanliness could be a shield against death itself. My father survived. I survived. Perhaps a third of the household survived. The rest were buried in a mass grave beyond the chapel, laid to rest without proper ceremony, without the comfort of the church's rites. When the sickness finally moved on, leaving our hall depleted but standing, we set about cleaning everything the sick had touched. Their bedding was burned. Their clothes were burned. Their eating vessels were scoured with sand and boiling water until no trace remained of those who had used them. And then we cleaned ourselves. Every person in the household bathed, fully and completely, as though we could wash away not merely the soil of those terrible weeks, but the presence of death itself. We heated water until the cauldrons were nearly dry. We scrubbed with soap and ash and sand. We washed our hair, our bodies, our very souls, if such a thing were possible. I remember standing in that tub in my father's chamber, the same tub I had used as a boy, and weeping, not from grief alone, though there was grief, but from the overwhelming sense that we had been spared, that we had passed through the valley of the shadow and emerged on the other side, and that this act of washing was somehow a return to life, a reclaiming of the world we had known. My father stood nearby watching me. He was thinner than before, aged by the weeks of watching his people die. But he was alive, and when I stepped from the water he handed me a cloth of clean linen and spoke words I have never forgotten. "We are still here," he said, "and as long as we are here we will maintain ourselves. We will wash. We will pray. We will remember that we are men made in God's image, and we will honour that image by caring for the body he gave us." The pestilence changed many things in England. It emptied villages, destroyed families, altered the very structure of how we lived. But it did not change the essential understanding that cleanliness was both a practical necessity and a spiritual duty. If anything, it reinforced it. In the years that followed, I saw more attention paid to washing, to the maintenance of clean water sources, to the disposal of refuse. People had seen what sickness could do, and they sought whatever protection they could find. I was knighted in the spring of 1350, kneeling before my father in his chapel while Father Benedict spoke the blessing. The sword that touched my shoulder had been my grandfather's, and would someday be my son's, if God granted me a son. With knighthood came responsibility. I took service with the Earl of Lincoln, joining his household as a knight bachelor, owing him 40 days of service each year, and answering his call to arms whenever the king required it. The rest of my time was my own, to manage a small manor that my father granted me near the village of Bardney. The manor house was modest, stone below and timber above, with a hall large enough for my household and a small chapel where a visiting priest said mass each Sunday. There was a well in the courtyard, a kitchen building separate from the hall, and a bathhouse that had been built by the previous lord, but had fallen into disrepair. I restored that bathhouse. It seemed to me important, a symbol of what I intended my household to be. I had the roof rethatched, the stones repointed, the wooden tub rebuilt. I installed a system for heating water, with a fire pit dug beneath a copper cauldron that could be filled from the well and heated without the need to carry boiling pots back and forth. When it was complete, I made it known to my household that Saturday bathing was not merely permitted but expected. Any person in my service, from the highest to the lowest, would have access to heated water and a place to wash. The knights and men-at-arms would bathe in rotation, as would the servants. Clean water for each group, soap provided from the household stores, privacy maintained. Some thought it excessive. A visiting knight from Yorkshire remarked that I ran my household like a monastery, with all this attention to washing and cleanliness. But I did not care. I had seen what filth could bring, had seen how quickly men could descend into degradation when standards were not maintained, and I was determined that my household, small as it was, would be a place of order. The pattern of life in those years was steady and predictable. I rose each morning and washed at a basin in my chamber, cold water carried up by a servant before dawn. I tended mass in the chapel, breaking my fast afterwards with bread and ale. I spent my mornings overseeing the manor, riding out to inspect fields and speak with tenants, ensuring that the work of planting or harvesting or maintenance was proceeding as it should. In the afternoons I trained, keeping my skills sharp against the day when they might be needed again. Sword work, lance work, riding, and each evening before supper I would wash again at that basin, cleaning away the day's accumulation before sitting at my own table. On Saturdays I bathed fully, and on Sundays I attended mass in clean clothes, my hands scrubbed, my beard trimmed, my hair combed. It was a rhythm, a pattern, and it gave shape to the weeks and months and years. I married in 1352 to the daughter of a knight whose lands bordered my own. Eleanor was her name, and she brought to my household not merely a dowry but a sensibility about cleanliness that matched my own. Her mother had taught her the management of a household, and one of the first things she did upon arriving at Bardney was to inspect the bathhouse. She approved, which pleased me more than I can say. She instituted a system for washing clothes that put my previous arrangements to shame. Twice a month all the household linens were gathered and washed in great tubs near the kitchen, using lye soap and hot water and much scrubbing. The wet clothes were then laid out to dry on bushes near the hall, or in the hall itself during winter, and when they were dry they were folded and stored in chests with bundles of lavender and rosemary to keep them sweet. She also ensured that the ladies of the household had their own time in the bathhouse, separate from the men, with attention paid to privacy and comfort. She herself bathed weekly, sometimes more often in summer, and she maintained a small table in our chamber, with a basin and ewer for daily washing. Watching her perform these small rituals, I was reminded of my mother all those years ago, standing beside the tub in my father's hall, teaching me that cleanliness was not merely about the body but about the soul. Eleanor understood this without my explaining it. She understood that a well-run household was one where these small acts of maintenance were not neglected, where water was valued, and soap was made, and clean linen was available to those who needed it. We had 4 children over the next 8 years, 2 sons and 2 daughters, though only 3 survived past infancy, and to each of them, as they grew old enough to understand, we taught the same lessons I had learned. Wash before prayer, wash before meals, wash after work. Care for the body that God has given you, for it is the temple in which your soul resides. I rode to France twice more during those middle years of my life, once in 1355 on a chevauchée through the Languedoc that achieved little save destruction, and again in 1359 on the campaign that led to the Treaty of Bretigny and the temporary peace between England and France. Both times the experience was the same. The initial order of a household in England, the careful maintenance of cleanliness and routine, gave way to the chaos of campaign life. The washing at basins became irregular. The Saturday baths disappeared entirely. The clean linen gave way to clothes worn until they could be worn no longer. But both times I maintained what standards I could. I washed my hands before eating. I rinsed my face each morning. I sought out streams and rivers where I could submerge myself, if only briefly, in cold water. And I watched other men do the same, saw how, even in the midst of campaign, even when resources were scarce and time was short, men sought these small acts of cleanliness as anchors to civilization. There was a moment during the campaign of 1359 that remains clear in my memory. We had been marching for days through territory that had already been ravaged by war, and we stopped near a monastery that had been abandoned years before. The monks had fled or died, and the buildings were falling into ruin, but there was still a water source, a spring that fed into a stone basin in what had been the cloister. Several of us went there to wash. It was evening, and the light was fading, and we stood around that basin passing a piece of soap between us, taking turns to duck our heads under the cold water and scrub at our faces and necks. One of the nights, a man named Robert, whom I had known for years, looked around at the ruined cloister and spoke. "They washed here," he said. "The monks. They washed in this very basin, morning and evening, as part of their rule." We all understood what he meant. The monks were gone, their community destroyed, their prayers silenced. But the basin remained and the water still flowed, and we were performing the same act they had performed, maintaining the same small ritual of cleanliness that had been part of human life for generations beyond counting. It was a holy moment, in its way. Not because we were holy men, but because we were continuing something that had been passed down through time, something that connected us to those monks and to all the people before them who had understood that washing was more than a practical act. We returned to England in the spring of 1360, and once again I went through the ritual of return, the full bath in heated water, the burning of clothes that could not be saved, the donning of clean linen, the gradual return to the patterns of home. But this time, returning to Bardney, I felt something shift within me. I was 35 years old. I'd been to war 3 times. I'd seen the pestilence. I'd married and fathered children. And I began to understand that the maintaining of cleanliness was not merely a habit, but a form of resistance. Resistance against chaos, against degradation, against the forces that would reduce men to beasts if given the opportunity. To wash each morning was to say, I'm still here, still human, still capable of caring for myself and others. To heat water for a bath was to say, I've not surrendered to circumstance. To put on clean linen was to say, I remember who I am and what I owe to God and to my station. These small acts, repeated day after day, year after year, were what held the world together. Not great deeds of warfare or statecraft, but the humble, constant attention to the maintenance of body and soul. The last war came in 1369, when the French broke the peace and King Edward called once more for his knights. I answered that call, though I was past 40 now, and felt it in my joints each morning. The Earl of Lincoln assembled his forces, and I rode with them to Portsmouth and again across the narrow sea. But this campaign was different from the others. I was no longer a young man eager to prove himself. I was a knight of experience who understood what war truly meant, and who had developed habits that could not be easily abandoned. I brought with me, packed among my equipment, a small basin, a piece of soap wrapped in linen, and a spare shirt. These were my concessions to reality. I knew I could not bathe properly while on campaign, but I could at least wash each day, could at least maintain some semblance of the standards I held at home. My squire, a capable young man named John, was instructed in the routine. Each evening, he was to bring water for washing. Each morning, if possible, the same. It was a small thing, but it mattered to me. The campaign itself was a failure. We marched, we fought small engagements, we achieved nothing of lasting significance. By autumn we were back in England, having accomplished little save the spending of the king's gold and the wearing down of our own bodies. I returned to Bardney knowing it would be my last campaign. I was too old now for the hardships of war, too aware of my own mortality, and I was grateful, profoundly grateful, to return to a life of order and cleanliness. Eleanor welcomed me home, and our children, now old enough to understand what their father had been doing, embraced me with relief. That evening, after I had bathed and dressed in clean clothes, we sat together at table and gave thanks to God for my safe return. The years that followed were quiet ones. I managed my manor, saw to my tenants, trained the young men who came to me for instruction in arms. I attended Mass each Sunday, participated in the life of the Shire, fulfilled my obligations to the Earl, and I maintained my routines: the morning washing, the Saturday bath, the clean linen, the attention to fingernails and hair, and the small details of bodily maintenance that distinguished a knight from a common soldier. I watched my children grow and marry and establish their own households. My eldest son took over the manor at Bardney when I grew too old to manage it properly. My daughters married well, to knights and landowners who understood the value of good management and clean living. And I taught my grandchildren, when they came, the same lessons I had learned as a boy: how to stand in cold water before dawn, how to wash before prayer, How to understand that the body is the temple of the Holy Ghost and must be maintained as such. I am old now. My hands shake as I write these words, and my eyes are weak. The world has changed around me. The pestilence returned twice more during my lifetime, each time taking more lives, each time altering the structure of England in ways I could not have imagined as a young man. But some things have not changed. The need to wash, the daily ritual of attending to the body's cleanliness, the understanding that these small acts matter, that they connect us to something larger than ourselves. I sit now in my son's hall in a chamber set aside for my use, and each morning a servant brings water for my washing. I am too frail to bathe fully anymore, to step into a tub and submerge myself as I once did. But I can still wash my hands, my face, my neck. I can still attend to these small rituals that have shaped my life. There is a question I have been asked by my grandchildren and others about whether all this attention to washing truly mattered, whether it made us healthier, cleaner, better men, whether the hours spent heating water and scrubbing skin and maintaining these routines were worth the effort. I cannot answer with certainty. I do not know if our washing protected us from sickness or merely gave us the illusion of protection. I do not know if clean hands truly brought us closer to God or merely satisfied a social expectation. I do not know if the distinction we drew between ourselves and the unwashed masses was real or merely imagined. But I know this. The act of washing, performed daily and with intention, reminded us that we were human. It reminded us that we had standards, expectations, a vision of how life ought to be lived. It gave structure to our days and meaning to our routines. In a world of chaos and violence and sudden death, these small acts of order mattered. They mattered not because they changed the world, but because they changed us. They made us pause each morning and evening to attend to ourselves. They made us consider, if only for a moment, what it meant to be made in God's image. They made us, in the midst of filth and fatigue, reach for something better. I think of my mother, standing beside that tub in my father's hall, telling me to wash before Mass. I think of Sir William, maintaining his standards even in the mud of a military camp. I think of my father, surviving the pestilence and speaking those words about maintaining ourselves as long as we lived. They understood something that I have spent a lifetime learning, that civilization is not built by great deeds alone, but by small acts repeated faithfully, that the washing of hands before prayer, the heating of water for a Saturday bath, the donning of clean linen on Sunday morning, these are the acts that separate us from chaos, and they are acts that anyone can perform, knight or peasant, lord or servant. They require no great wealth, no special knowledge, only water which God provides, only soap which can be made from ash and fat, only the will to care for the body he gave us. There is a basin in my chamber, a simple wooden bowl that sits on a table near the window. Each morning, as I have said, a servant fills it with water drawn from the well. Sometimes the water is cold, sometimes tepid if it has been drawn after the sun has warmed the stones. I perform my ablutions slowly now, for my hands no longer move with the sureness they once had. I wet a cloth and wipe my face, my neck, behind my ears. I clean my hands, working the water between my fingers, under my nails. I rinse my mouth, spit into a basin kept for that purpose. These acts take longer than they once did. What could be accomplished in moments when I was young now requires careful attention, deliberate movement. But I do them, each morning without fail, because they are who I am. Yesterday, my eldest grandson came to visit. He is 16, the age I was when I first wore full armour, and he will soon be knighted himself. He found me at my morning washing and stood watching, curious. "Did you always do this?" he asked. "Even when you were at war?" I thought about the camps, the rivers, the cold water sluiced over tired bodies. "I tried," I said. "I did not always succeed, but I tried." He nodded, considering this. "My father says you are particular about cleanliness, that you require everyone in your household to bathe regularly." "I do," I said. "Or I did, when I had a household to manage." "Why?" It was a fair question, deserving a fair answer. "Because we are not beasts," I said. "Because we are made in God's image, and that image must be maintained. Because the small acts of caring for ourselves remind us what it means to be human." I dried my hands on a cloth and turned to face him. "You will be a knight soon. You will ride to war if war comes. You will live in camps and castles, in mud and smoke and all the chaos that accompanies armed men. And in the midst of that chaos, you will be tempted to abandon the small courtesies, the daily rituals, the maintenance of cleanliness." I paused, seeing in his young face an echo of my own youth. "Do not abandon them. Wash when you can. Attend to your body as you attend to your weapons. Remember that to be a knight is not merely to fight well, but to live well. And living well begins with these small acts of care." He listened, though I could not tell if he truly understood. Understanding comes with time, with experience, with the slow accumulation of years and the recognition that what seemed unimportant was actually essential. But he will learn, as I learned, as we all learned. This morning I performed my washing as I always do. The water was cold, drawn before dawn, and it shocked my old skin the way it shocked my young skin all those years ago. I wiped my face, cleaned my hands, rinsed my mouth, and then I sat by the window, looking out at the courtyard where servants were already moving about their tasks. One of them was carrying water from the well, 2 heavy buckets balanced on a yoke across her shoulders. She would carry that water to the kitchen, where it would be heated for cooking, for washing, for all the countless uses that make daily life possible. Water. Such a simple thing, such a common thing, and yet everything depends upon it. I have lived for more than 70 years, and in that time I have seen much. War and peace, sickness and health, birth and death. I've been a boy shivering in a tub, a young knight marching through France, a household lord managing his manor, and now an old man waiting for the end. And through it all, the constant presence of water, the daily washing, the Saturday bath, the attention to cleanliness that marked me as a man of station and faith. Was it important? Did it matter? I believe it did, not because it made us better than others, but because it reminded us to be better than we might otherwise have been. Not because it guaranteed health or holiness, but because it was a way of reaching for both. The basin sits on the table, the water still and clear in the morning light. Tomorrow morning I will wash again, if God grants me another day. And the morning after that, and the morning after that, until there are no more mornings. This is what I know. We are dust, and to dust we shall return. But while we live, while breath still moves in our lungs and blood still courses through our veins, we have a duty to care for the body God gave us, a duty to maintain ourselves with whatever means we have available, a duty to wash, to clean, to attend to the small rituals that make us human. This is what I have learned across all the years of my life. This is what I leave to those who come after me. The water waits in the basin, clear, cold, patient, and I wash my hands one more time as I have washed them 10,000 times before, as men have washed their hands since the beginning of days. It is enough. It has always been enough. The film of life itself, clinging to skin and soul alike, washes away in the morning light, and for a moment, I am clean.